When I told my parents I finally forgave them, my mother laughed and said she never felt guilty, so my church family cried with me that night. I need to write this down somewhere because it's either this or go crazy from holding it in. I'm 17 now, and for as long as I can remember, I've known I was unwanted. My parents, Diane and Gary, weren't the kind that yelled or hit or left bruises, but I almost think that would have been easier to explain. Instead, they gave me silence, cold stares, and months of emotional starvation dressed up as parenting. They gave me dinner but never asked how school went, and they bought me clothes but never remembered my birthday. I used to think maybe they were just tired or stressed, or maybe they loved me deep down but didn't know how to show it. I stopped thinking that sometime around the age of 9, when I heard my mom on the phone telling her friend that I'd ruined her 20s and that I was a phase she couldn't get rid of yet. She didn't whisper either. She said it like I wasn't even in the room. I sat behind the door, knees to my chest, trying to figure out what I'd done wrong just by being born. From that moment, I stopped expecting anything warm from her and started learning how to disappear inside my own head. School wasn't much better. From the first grade, I knew I was different, and not in any kind of cool or mysterious way. I was the quiet one, the weird one, the kid who brought his own pencil because he didn't want to ask the teacher. I wore clothes from 3 years ago, and even though I never said anything mean to anyone, that didn't protect me from being laughed at for everything from my haircut to the way I walked. Some kids get bullied for fighting back. I got bullied just for existing. By middle school, there was a name for it: Trevor. He made it his mission to remind me daily that I didn't belong. It started with insults, then turned into shoving, then escalated to actual bruises he knew I wouldn't report. He once ripped my backpack off in front of the entire hallway and dumped the contents onto the floor. Kids stepped on my notebook, laughed at my bent glasses, and just kept walking. I remember picking up every paper slowly while pretending it didn't matter. I did that every day. I pretended none of it mattered. Then I'd go home, sit in my room with the door locked, and try not to cry loud enough for my parents to hear and mock me for being dramatic. My dad wasn't any softer. He didn't hit either, but he once looked me in the eyes and said I'd better toughen up before life swallowed me whole. That was his way of preparing me, I guess. He called me soft, pathetic, a waste of space on the days he actually acknowledged I existed. The rest of the time, he just watched TV while my mom scrolled on her phone, and I sat in the same room without a single word exchanged between us. I think the moment I stopped trying to earn their love came the day they forgot to pick me up from school after a snowstorm. I waited outside for 2 hours in a soaked hoodie because they didn't answer my calls. When I got home, after walking through slush for 3 miles, my mom said she thought I'd had a ride and went back to watching her show. I stood there dripping, hands numb, face red, and realized I could have vanished that afternoon and neither of them would have noticed until the school called. But there was one person who noticed me, eventually. His name was Mason, and he sat 2 rows behind me in 6th grade. He was the only person who didn't laugh when I dropped my tray in the cafeteria. I remember he helped me pick it up and said, "Man, Mondays, right?" As if we were old friends. Mason was taller, louder, and he had this way of making people listen when he spoke. But underneath it all, I think he was just as lost as I was. He had this haunted look sometimes, like he was seeing something the rest of us couldn't. We didn't become friends instantly. It took time. But I started to notice how he always chose to sit next to me when the seats were free. How he'd glance at my bruises and then say nothing, but shift closer like a human shield. One day, after Trevor had shoved me into a locker hard enough to knock the wind out of me, Mason followed me into the library. I didn't know he was there until I heard him sit across from me and say, "I saw what he did. You all right?" I nodded, but my voice cracked when I tried to answer. That's when he said something that stuck. "You don't have to act like it doesn't hurt just to survive." We started spending more time together. I didn't tell him everything. How could I? I barely understood it myself. But we played video games after school sometimes, and we shared chips at lunch, and once he even gave me his hoodie when mine got torn. Mason had his own demons. He once said his stepdad was the kind of guy who could ruin a room just by walking into it. But he never cried about it, never talked much about feelings. He just joked, or stayed silent, or disappeared when things got too real. I think I would have lost my mind completely if it hadn't been for that day in the library when I found the Bible. I wasn't religious. My parents never went to church, and the only time I heard God mentioned at home was when my dad used his name as a curse. But that day, I was hiding again, trying not to cry after another humiliating gym class, and I sat in the corner of the library behind the nonfiction section. Someone had left an old, slightly torn Bible on the shelf. I don't know why I opened it. Maybe because it was there, maybe because I just wanted something, anything, to make the pain stop. I started reading random lines, flipping through, stopping at phrases that sounded like they were written just for me. That night, I went back and read more. I didn't understand most of it, but the verses about suffering, about strength through trials, about not being alone even when everyone around you is silent, that hit something deep inside me. I didn't tell Mason at first. It felt private, like I was holding onto something fragile and new. But I started carrying the Bible in my backpack, and one day, Mason saw it when I was pulling out my lunch. He didn't laugh. He just raised his eyebrows and asked, "You really reading that?" I nodded, bracing myself for a joke. Instead, he said, "Maybe I should too. Might help me sleep." And just like that, something changed. After that conversation, things between me and Mason started to shift even more. He wasn't just the kid who sat beside me at lunch anymore. He became someone I trusted in a way I didn't even realize was possible before. We started reading together after school in the library, mostly the Bible at first, but sometimes books about history or philosophy that he said helped him think. He didn't always get what the verses meant, and neither did I, but we tried to piece them together like puzzles that might mean something bigger. On Sunday, 2 weeks later, I asked him if he wanted to come with me to a youth group service I'd been too nervous to go to alone. He shrugged like it didn't matter either way, but I saw how fast he said yes. The church wasn't anything fancy. It was a red brick building near the edge of town with a cracked parking lot and a crooked wooden cross out front. Inside, it was small, maybe 30 folding chairs and a dusty piano in the corner. But it felt different from everywhere else. Like nobody cared who you were when you walked in, only that you came. Pastor Joel ran the youth group. He was maybe 30, dressed in jeans and boots, and talked like a big brother instead of a preacher. He didn't yell, didn't guilt trip, didn't pretend life was perfect. That first night, he said something I'll never forget. God never promised we'd avoid suffering. He promised we wouldn't suffer alone. I didn't say anything, but I felt like my chest cracked open just hearing those words. Mason sat next to me the whole time, arms crossed, not reacting, but I saw how he stopped tapping his foot and started listening. We started going every week. Sometimes Mason would get there before me, already talking to someone about the music or helping carry in snacks. He joked that he still wasn't sold on the God thing, but it was better than staying home with his mom and her boyfriend screaming in the kitchen. I believed him, but I also saw how he started sitting up straighter, how the shadows under his eyes slowly faded. He even smiled more. Real smiles, not the ones he used to throw on to survive a bad moment. That made me hopeful. It made me believe this could actually help us both. At school, not much changed on the outside. Trevor was still Trevor. He'd shove me into lockers or bark out my name in the hallway like a warning. But something inside me started to shift. I didn't look at the floor anymore. I stopped flinching. Not because I got stronger physically, but because I started believing he didn't control who I was. The more I read, the more I prayed, the more I felt like maybe I wasn't a mistake like my parents made me think. I didn't need their love to have value. I had something bigger. It was still small, like a flickering candle in the dark, but it was mine. There was one day when it all felt like maybe life could finally turn around. Mason and I were walking home from church, talking about something Pastor Joel had said about grace being stronger than guilt. Mason suddenly stopped, looked at me, and said, "Do you really think he loves us? I mean, like, actually cares." I didn't know what to say right away. I wanted to shout yes, but instead I just said, "I think it's the only thing that's kept me alive this long." Mason nodded, not smiling, but looking at the sky like he wanted to believe it too. But even then, I could feel it starting, something darker building in him again. He started missing youth group some weeks. He said he had headaches or had to help his mom with something, but I knew better. He was retreating, pulling back the way he used to when things got too real. He'd show up at school looking more tired, more guarded. The spark that had started to form in his eyes during service was flickering again. I asked him about it once, gently, and he just shrugged and said, "It's hard, man. Believing in something you can't see." I told him I got it. I really did. But I also told him that sometimes I felt God the most in the moments when it seemed like no one else was listening. When I was locked in my room and crying silently under the covers so my parents wouldn't hear. When I was walking home in the rain without a coat because no one cared enough to ask where I was. When Mason handed me a second sandwich at lunch without saying anything. In all those moments, something told me I wasn't actually alone, even if I couldn't explain it. Mason didn't respond. He just nodded and changed the subject. That was the first real silence between us in weeks, and I felt it settle like a weight on my chest. A few days later, I caught him staring out the window in science class, not taking notes, not even pretending to pay attention. After class, I tried to talk to him, but he brushed me off with a tight smile and said he was just tired. He wasn't. He was somewhere else entirely, and I didn't know how to reach him. The next Sunday, he didn't come to church. Then the next week, he didn't come again. I texted him, called him, even stopped by his house. His mom said he wasn't feeling well, but her eyes were red and she didn't invite me in. That night, he finally messaged me. Just a single text. "Do you really believe he's watching this? All of it? And still doing nothing?" I didn't know how to answer. I stared at my phone for nearly an hour before I wrote back. "I don't know why bad things happen, but I don't think we're alone in them." He never responded. I kept going to youth group, but I felt like half my body had gone missing. I'd sit through the lessons, nodding, listening, even volunteering to help clean up, but there was a constant ache in my chest like something precious had been misplaced, and I didn't know where to begin searching. Pastor Joel asked if everything was okay, and I lied. I said school was just stressful. I didn't know how to tell him that the one person who helped pull me out of the darkness was slipping back into it and wouldn't let me follow. Sometimes, I'd look around the church and wonder what it would take to really save someone like Mason. Not just bring them in the door, not just introduce them to a new set of beliefs, but actually make them feel like they belonged, like they mattered. I started reading more. I stayed up late with my Bible open, flipping pages, highlighting verses, looking for something, anything, I could use to bring him back from whatever edge he was standing on. But I didn't even know where that edge was. The longer the silence lasted between us, the more I began to doubt myself. Had I said too much? Not enough? Had I done something wrong? Was I clinging to something because I needed it to mean something, even if it didn't fix anything at all? But then I'd remember the days when Mason laughed, when he smiled during service, when he asked if God actually loved us. That meant something. That had to mean something. People don't ask those questions if they don't want an answer. They don't look up at the ceiling and whisper doubts unless they hope someone's listening. And so I kept praying. For him. For myself. For both of us. There's something terrifying about watching someone disappear in plain sight, piece by piece, day by day. Mason wasn't gone all at once. He faded slowly, like color draining from a photograph left in the sun. The week after his last message, I didn't hear from him at all, and when I saw him at school, he avoided my eyes like I'd done something wrong just by caring. He sat in the back of class now, hoodie up, earbuds in, barely speaking unless called on. His laugh, once loud enough to echo through the halls, vanished like it never existed. One afternoon after class, I caught up to him by the parking lot and asked if he was okay. He looked at me like I'd asked something too painful to answer. He said, "I'm fine, man. Just tired," and walked away before I could say more. I stood there in the cold, watching his back get smaller, wondering how a person could be right in front of you and still feel so far gone. I started writing him letters, short ones, nothing dramatic, just verses that meant something to me, reminders that he wasn't forgotten. I left them in his locker once a week. I never signed them, but I hoped he knew they were from me. A few weeks later, I got a text. It wasn't a full message, just one line. "Do you think we're being tested or just punished?" I stared at that sentence for minutes, like it held the key to something I'd never dared ask myself out loud. I wanted to scream no, that life wasn't some cruel game with winners and losers. I wanted to say that faith wasn't about earning comfort but finding strength in chaos. But all I wrote back was, "Tested. And we don't fail by hurting. We fail by giving up." He didn't reply. I kept going to church, but every time I stepped inside, I felt like I was dragging a shadow with me. Pastor Joel noticed it. He stopped me after youth group one evening and asked if I wanted to talk. At first, I said no, because that's what I was used to doing, pretending. But then I looked around at the empty chairs and the dusty piano and realized this was probably the only place in the world where someone actually cared. So I told him about Mason. Not everything, but enough. Enough for him to nod and say gently, "Not everyone who comes through those doors is ready to stay. But that doesn't mean your presence wasn't a blessing." That line stayed with me. I repeated it in my head like a mantra when the nights got hard, when I lay in bed wondering if I was really helping anyone by staying faithful or just deluding myself into believing this story had purpose. My parents still ignored me. My dad still made snide comments when I mentioned church. My mom still rolled her eyes when I turned down their dinner invites to attend Sunday service. But I didn't need their approval anymore. I wasn't searching for their validation like I used to. Instead, I threw myself into serving. I helped clean up after youth group, helped Pastor Joel organize supply drives, even offered to walk younger kids home when their parents were late. It gave me purpose, even if it didn't fix the ache in my chest. There were moments, small, fleeting moments, when I felt peace. Like when Lily, a girl from youth group, asked if I could show her how to read scripture the way I did. Or when Mr. Connors pulled me aside at school and said he was proud of how much I'd grown. But none of it made Mason come back. And then one morning, I heard the rumors. Whispers in the hallway that Mason had dropped out. That his mom moved without telling anyone. That his stepdad got arrested for something unrelated. And they just packed up and left. No goodbyes. No warning. Just gone. I ran home that day and scrolled through every message thread, every saved voicemail, anything that might tell me where he was or why he hadn't said anything. Nothing. His number was disconnected. His socials deleted. Like he'd never existed in the first place. I couldn't breathe. I didn't cry. I just sat on the floor of my bedroom with the lights off, holding the last letter I'd never given him. Inside was a verse I'd read the night before. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." I had underlined it 3 times. I thought he needed to hear that. I thought maybe it would have reached him. But now he was gone, and all I had left was silence. I stopped going to youth group for a while. I told Pastor Joel I needed time, and he understood, but I saw the worry in his eyes. I started skipping meals, skipping homework, skipping conversations. I would sit in school surrounded by people and feel like I was encased in glass, present but unreachable. I even snapped at Mr. Connors once, when he asked if I wanted to talk. I told him to stop pretending he cared just because he got paid to. The look on his face crushed me more than any punishment ever could. It wasn't anger driving me. It was grief. Pure, unbearable grief that no one warned me about. No one tells you how hard it is to lose someone who's still alive. There's no funeral. No closure. Just a question that repeats in your brain on an endless loop. What did I miss? What did I do wrong? One night, I went back to the church alone. It was late, well past youth group hours, and the lights were off. But the door was unlocked, so I walked in and sat in the last row. I didn't pray. I didn't even think. I just sat there, staring at the empty stage, feeling like if I moved too much, I'd fall apart. After a long time, I whispered Mason's name into the dark, like maybe God would hear it and pass it along. Like maybe, wherever Mason was, he'd feel it. That night, I dreamed of him. Not a dramatic dream. We were just sitting on a park bench, sharing a bag of chips like we used to. He looked at me and said, "You didn't fail me, man." I just wasn't ready. When I woke up, I cried for the first time in weeks. Not just because I missed him, but because deep down, I'd started to believe maybe I really did fail him. That dream reminded me he made his own choice, and I wasn't responsible for saving him. I returned to church that week. Pastor Joel welcomed me back without asking for an explanation. Just a smile and a pat on the shoulder that said he was glad I came. And even though the ache in my chest didn't vanish, it dulled just enough for me to breathe again. I started praying more, not for answers, but for peace. Not just for myself, but for Mason too, wherever he was. Because even if he couldn't stay, even if the darkness swallowed him for now, I wasn't going to stop believing that one day he'd see the light again. Some people think faith is supposed to fix everything, like it's a magic formula for happiness. Like if you pray hard enough or believe deep enough, all the pain goes away and your story ends with smiles and healing. I used to think that too back when I first found church and Mason found me. But now, standing in the silence that followed his disappearance, I realized faith doesn't remove the storm. It teaches you how to stay standing in the middle of it without breaking apart. After I returned to church, I noticed how much had changed while I was gone. A few new kids had joined youth group, and Pastor Joel had started a new series on resilience, how scars don't mean we're weak, they mean we survived. I tried listening, but everything still reminded me of Mason. The empty chair next to mine, the songs we used to hum under our breath, the verse he once marked in my Bible, folded into a triangle like he always did with notes. Even the smell of the room felt different without him in it. But slowly, week by week, I stopped waiting for him to walk back through the door. I stopped checking my phone for messages that wouldn't come. I started talking more during prayer circle, not because I had answers, but because I was finally okay with not having them. I admitted out loud for the first time that I didn't understand why God let people we love slip through our fingers. But I also said I believed he still listened, even when we cried into a pillow so quietly that no one else could hear. One night, Pastor Joel asked if I'd consider mentoring one of the younger boys who had just joined. His name was Connor, 12 years old, skittish, quiet, with eyes that didn't trust anyone yet. I hesitated at first. I didn't think I had anything worth offering. But then I remembered how Mason used to sit beside me in the cafeteria, not saying much, just being there. Sometimes presence means more than words ever could. So I said yes. I sat with Connor during service, walked him home twice, and listened when he mumbled about his dad being gone and his mom always working late. The first time he opened up to me, we were sitting under a broken streetlight near his building. He asked if I ever felt like a ghost, like I could scream in the middle of a crowd and no one would hear it. I nodded, then said, "Yeah, every day." But eventually, I found a place that heard me whisper. He didn't say anything after that, but I saw something shift in his face. Not a full smile, just a softness around the eyes, like maybe he believed me. It wasn't just Connor. Slowly, other people started reaching out. A girl named Julia asked me how I stayed so calm when life felt impossible. A kid I barely knew from school saw me reading on the bus and asked what the verse meant. Even Mr. Connors pulled me aside one afternoon and thanked me for not giving up when so many others did. That meant something coming from him. He was one of the few adults I respected, the kind who never looked through you or spoke like you were a burden. But even in those moments of connection, the ache for Mason never fully left. Some nights, I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, wondering where he was sleeping, whether he found peace or just sank deeper into his own doubts. I thought about writing him one more letter, even though I had no address, no way to send it, and no guarantee he'd ever read it. I just wanted him to know he mattered, that his presence changed my life, even if his absence still haunted me. So I wrote the letter anyway. I wrote that I missed him, that I wasn't mad, that I understood how heavy the world could feel when you were carrying wounds no one else could see. I told him how I kept reading the Bible and how some nights I still asked the same questions he did. I told him about Connor and how I sat beside another quiet kid the way Mason once sat beside me. I ended the letter by writing the words I wish I'd said sooner. You helped me believe I deserved to be seen. And I'll never forget that. I folded the letter and kept it in my Bible, tucked behind Mason's favorite psalm. I don't know why. Maybe because it gave me a way to carry him with me, not just as a loss, but as a beginning. A seed that planted something real in my life, even if it didn't grow the way I expected. And maybe that's what faith really is. Not some perfect answer to every question, but a decision to keep going even when the story takes a turn you didn't want. At school, things weren't perfect, but they got better. Trevor still existed, still barked his nonsense in the hallway, but something had changed. Maybe I walked differently now. Maybe I just didn't flinch the way I used to. Whatever it was, he stopped bothering me. He found easier targets, kids who hadn't learned yet that you don't have to fight back with fists to win. You just have to know who you are and never hand that power to someone else again. One afternoon, I caught Trevor looking at me across the hallway, just a glance. I didn't see mockery this time. I saw confusion. Like he couldn't understand how the kid he used to push around now stood taller without ever throwing a punch. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just looked back and kept walking. Not because I was better than him, but because I no longer needed his opinion to define me. That was something Mason helped me learn too. Faith didn't erase my pain. It didn't bring Mason back. It didn't turn my parents into loving people who noticed my absence when I stayed out late. But it gave me something stronger than all of that. It gave me roots. And with roots, even when the wind hits hard, you don't break. You bend. You endure. You hold on. There was a Sunday in spring, clear skies, soft wind, the kind of day that feels like a fresh start, when Pastor Joel asked me to speak during service. Just 5 minutes, he said. Share something real. I almost said no. I almost walked out. But then I remembered Mason's voice, low and uncertain, asking if God actually loved us. That question lived in my chest for months. And now, for the first time, I felt like I had an answer, not perfect, not complete, but real. So I stood at the front of the room and looked out at faces I used to avoid. I told them about Mason, about pain, about praying in the dark and not hearing anything back. I told them how faith doesn't erase suffering but walks with us through it. I told them how one friend who saw you at your worst could change your whole life. And when I stepped down, I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I felt peace. Because I knew I had done something Mason never got the chance to do. I stayed. The day I turned 18, my parents didn't say anything, not even a simple happy birthday. No card. No cake. Just silence, like every other day in that house. I left that morning without saying goodbye and walked across town to Pastor Joel's office with my backpack and a duffel bag packed with everything I owned. I wasn't running away. I was finally walking towards something I chose. I had saved up just enough from the small jobs at church to rent a single room above a barber shop owned by someone who knew Pastor Joel and was willing to take a chance on me. The room was small, barely enough space for a bed and a folding desk, but it was mine. No yelling in the next room. No slammed doors. No pretending to be invisible so I wouldn't upset anyone. That first night, I sat on the floor and cried harder than I had in years, not because I was sad, but because I was free. I fell asleep with the Bible on my chest, the letter to Mason tucked inside it like a bookmark for a chapter I'd never stop rereading. I started volunteering full-time at the youth center connected to the church. It wasn't glamorous, mostly cleaning, tutoring, listening, but it gave my days structure and my heart purpose. I met kids who reminded me of younger versions of myself. Kids who were quiet and bruised and trying to stay small enough not to be hurt. I didn't preach at them. I just sat beside them. I remembered what it felt like to have one person choose to see you, and I decided to become that person for someone else. One boy, Tyler, stuck with me. He was 10, wore long sleeves in the summer, and didn't smile much. The first week, he wouldn't speak. The second, he started nodding. By the third, he asked me if I believed in miracles. I said yes, but not the flashy kind. I told him about the day Mason picked up my lunch tray. The day a Bible fell into my hands like it had been waiting there for me. The day I walked out of a house full of silence and into a life filled with voices that finally cared. Some nights I still struggled. I'd wake up from dreams where Mason came back, only to remember he was still gone. Or worse, I'd dream of him walking away from me in a crowd, calling my name but never turning back. I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was safe, wondering if he remembered any of the things we shared. I still hadn't heard from him, not a letter, not a phone call, not a rumor from someone who knew someone who'd seen him. I learned to live with the not knowing. Some days it hurt more than others. But I never stopped praying. I prayed that he'd find his way, not back to me, but back to peace. I prayed he'd meet someone who'd sit beside him like he once sat beside me. I prayed that even if his story didn't end the way I hoped, it would still be filled with moments of light that pierced through the dark. Years passed, and I kept building my life in small, quiet pieces. I got certified in youth counseling through a local program. I started leading group talks at the center. I wrote articles for a local faith magazine about recovery, doubt, and survival. I never used Mason's name in them, but he was in every sentence. He was the thread that held the fabric together, even if no one else could see it. One rainy evening, I got a letter. No return address. Just my name in handwriting I recognized instantly, even after all that time. My hand shook as I opened it. It wasn't long. Mason wrote that he was sorry for disappearing, that he wasn't ready to believe when I needed him to. He said he carried guilt for leaving, but also gratitude for everything I gave him: faith, patience, friendship. He didn't say where he was, didn't make promises to reconnect. He just said thank you. And then, at the very bottom, one sentence: I still think about you every time I see a Bible. I reread that letter until the ink started to blur from my fingerprints. I didn't cry. I didn't need to, because that was enough. It was more than I ever expected. It meant he was alive. It meant I hadn't imagined the connection we shared. It meant that somewhere, in a world that often felt too loud and too cruel, a part of what we built had stayed with him. That was all I ever wanted, for something we shared to outlive the silence that tried to erase us. The next Sunday, I spoke at church again. I didn't talk about Mason directly. I talked about faith that survives when no one's watching. I talked about choosing to love people who might walk away. I talked about planting seeds you might never see grow. I said that sometimes the greatest miracle is not being saved, but being strong enough to keep going when you're not. People cried. Some came up to thank me afterward. But none of that compared to what I felt walking home alone, holding Mason's letter like a fragile treasure in my jacket pocket. I'm 20 now. I still live above the barber shop. I still volunteer at the center. I still read the Bible at night, sometimes out loud, sometimes quietly, always with intention. I still carry that letter. I've read it so many times that I know it by heart. I haven't heard from Mason since, and maybe I never will. But he gave me something I can never repay, the chance to prove that love, even when it's not perfect, still matters. That faith, even when cracked, still holds. I think about all the nights I almost gave up. All the mornings I woke up feeling like nothing would ever change. All the times I stood in the middle of a hallway, bruised and alone, wondering if anyone would ever notice if I disappeared. And I think about who I became because I didn't. Because Mason didn't just save me once. He saved me every time I remembered him and chose to stay strong instead of giving into bitterness. Sometimes people ask me why I still believe. I tell them the truth. I believe because it saved me. I believe because I've seen what faith can do when nothing else works. I believe because one boy with his own broken pieces chose to sit beside mine, and that moment changed the trajectory of my life forever. I believe because even when people vanish, the love they left behind echoes louder than silence. I may have lost my only friend to doubt, but I didn't lose the lesson he left behind. And because of that, I'm not alone. Not really. Not ever again.